Hey, today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to compare 3 APIs against each other. Join me for this API review. So, who are we comparing? We're going to be comparing 3 leading APIs in the communication space: Twilio, Vonage, and Infobip. All 3 have Open API specifications and allow you to send SMS messages. We're going to focus in on the SMS aspect of their API because it's what they've all got in common. Let's go look at our first competitor, Twilio. Twilio has quite a nice homepage and it's quite easy to navigate to find the developer documentation that you need. That is definitely one point for them. So let's go look at that developer documentation and try and understand how good their API is. So they call their SMS messaging programmable messaging. So it allows you to send messages across multiple channels, but we're going to kind of focus in on the SMS because they've all got that in common. Now when we open up the API documentation for the message resource with Twilio, it is overwhelming. There's so much going on, my eyes just don't know where to look. It's clear that I can send an SMS message in multiple languages. I can see the example JSON response I'm going to get, and there's lots of information boxes available to me. It's overwhelming. I don't want to read it. I just want to know how to send an SMS. So let's break this down. I send a post request to api.twilio.com/add for the version /accounts/my Twilio account /messages.json. I then add a from number, a body that I want to send, and a to phone number as well. And then I authenticate using my Twilio account SID and the Twilio auth token using HTTP basic auth from the looks of it. Now that's quite a big amount of information to send. I'm already giving you my Twilio account SID in my authentication, so surely I could just do a post request to accounts messages.json if need be, and you can send my message. That sounds like it would be a lot easier. I've now sent my message and I'm getting quite a big payload back. I'm getting the account SID back, API version, the body, date created, sent, updated, the direction the message is going, an error code and an error message, who it's from, the messaging service SID, number of media, number of segments, price unit, SID, status, sub-resource URLs, to URI, wow, I just wanted to send a text message. Just tell me, here's the idea of what you sent, here's the direction it's going, how much did it cost me? Why do you have to give me just so much information when all I want to know is, did you get my request and are you going to send that message? So let's move on. Let's now look at Vonage. Vonage again have quite a nice clean website, and it's clear, well, it's not really clear what they're doing here. It's very much a business focused website. So why don't we focus more on the documentation and see where we can get to. So Vonage, I like your docs. They are nice and it gives me all the information that I want straight away. If I scroll down, I can see exactly what I need to do. Nothing's overwhelming me. It's just a very handy guide walking me through how to use it. That is definitely a bonus. So let's look at sending a message. I make a post request to api.nextmo.com/v1/messages. So for any confusion, Vonage used to be called Nextmo. So in a lot of the API specifications, a lot of the documentation, you'll see the word Nextmo. Ignore that, it is Vonage. but already I'm seeing a much easier route that I can post to. There's no confusing date stamp for my version. I'm not having to pass through my account SID or build up some crazy old URL to send a message. It's just a post to V1 messages. Perfect. So next up, I pass in my authorization token. I can either choose to send over a basic authentication or a JWT. It's nice to have those options. And then we get to the message body, and you've got a lot of fields, or you've got required fields. The required fields are message text, text to, from, and channel. Simpler. If you want to extend that, you can pass in a TTL for the time to live, when you want to send it, the SMS, how you want to encode it, client reference, any webhooks that you might want to attach, and that's it. That's all you need to do. It is just clean and simple. If we compare that to Twilio that we just saw, I'm already leaning towards using Vonage over Twilio because it's just easier to use and understand. Now let's look at these responses, because it's always important to understand how the API responds. So we've got various response types. We can see a 202, a 401, 402, 422, 429, 500, and each one gives you a different payload. Now, this is where I'm happy. Vonage are returning a 202 because they aren't sending it straight away. They are accepting your request and they're going to queue your SMS to be sent. They're not just saying 200 OK. They're saying, we have accepted your request and we're going to deal with it. But it gives you a message UUID to work with to then later on check that status. To me, Vonage, you're doing APIs right. Finally, Infobip, the quiet contender. You don't make as much noise as Twilio or Vonage. But you do have a nice website. I can understand what you're there to do. I know I'm going to be sending communications over your API, so why don't we look at your documentation and see how you stack up against your noisy competitors. So first off, I'm seeing everything I would expect to see. I'm seeing clean documentation, busier than Vonage was. Not as busy as Twilio though, that's a bonus. I can see you've got samples in lots of different languages, and I can see that I make a post request to SMS/2/text/advanced. I'm not 100% sure why the URL path is so long, but there might be a reason. It shows me that you support 4 different authentication types, which, why not? Choice is great. And if we look at the body itself, we see that we need to send messages to certain destinations from and with some text. Overall, it's good. Maybe a little bit more complicated than what Vonage was, but it's nice. So let's look at that response. We've got example responses for that 200 response, the 400 response, the 401 and the 500. What that's telling me is that you're just accepting that request and giving me a 200 OK. Not the best. Take a leaf out of Vonage's book and perhaps look at 202, we've accepted this request, unless you're going to send it straight away. Then give me that 201. But give me that 200 response. Perhaps a little bit lazy. But of course Twilio didn't even tell me the responses. Next up we've got a 400 response, which basically says it was a bad request. From what I can tell, that's just a catch-all. If it's failing validation, if it's doing anything other than server error or authentication error, it's going to give me that 400. That is my assumption here. It just tells me a bad request in the content, so I'd have to really dig in. It's not giving me helpful advice there. 401 is telling me that it's unauthorized, to be expected, and 500, something went wrong, contact support because general error, something happened, probably us, might not be. So it's okay. There's a lot of room here for improvement. Response status codes to start with. The response body could be a little bit nicer. You're giving me back a bulk ID and then a list of messages, because it looks like you support mostly sending bulk messages at once instead of just one at a time, which, fair enough, you're going to do it slightly differently. But you're going to give me a message ID and a status. What group that in? Is it a pending? Is it been accepted? What's the description? Where is it going? You give me some useful information back on that response. But you're not telling me the status of my request at the same time. You're just telling me 200 and wanting me to look into the request body. We're using HTTP here. Let's agree on that and let's stick to that, please. Now, sending a message. Yeah, you might be sending it to multiple people, so I understand why your request body needs to be in a certain way. Overall, it's good. Not as good as Vonage, but definitely better than Twilio. So, Infobip, you've got a good API there. Now, usually at this point I would show you uploading the specification to API Insights and going through the report. But we've got 3 different APIs to look at, and I'm sure you don't want to watch that 3 times. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a little bit of editing magic, chop it all together, and give you some results. So first up, Twilio. So as you can see, Twilio's messaging API got a low score. The highlight is probably the design, where they got a D, but on performance and security they got Fs. Let's dig into why that might be the case. If we look at the design, we can see that they support JSON and versioning, they've got consistent noun usage, and they use multiple HTTP methods. However, they don't have very robust responses, there isn't consistent pluralization, and they don't document any usage of rate limiting. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was receiving text messages from an automated service, I would want there to be some level of rate limiting in place, just in case. So, performance, not great. We got an F, reasonable load time. HTTP2 usage isn't there, there's no caching, not using any CDNs, and there's no compression support either. Now, some of that I can forgive. So when you're sending SMS messages, compression could really mess up that character encoding, which you wouldn't want to happen. If the API is mostly going to be used for sending data, there's not a heavy requirement for any caching. We can forgive that. But HTTP2, come on, Twilio, what are you playing at? Let's look at security, see if it cheers us up. So, as most APIs that I've seen, we're getting an F. They are authorizing all requests, and they do have secure URLs. But again, those optional headers are always seeming to be missing. There's no content type options, or CSP headers, or strict transport security headers. They aren't going that extra mile to increase the security of that HTTP request itself. Not terrible, not the best, but I'm sure the competitors will do better. Now we're going to take a look at Vonage. Okay, so I expected maybe better than that. Again, Vonage also got an F. They got an F for design, an F for performance, but they did get a C for security. Let's have a look at the score and let's see where they're going wrong and where maybe they could improve. So design. They're not versioning. There's no consistent noun usage. They don't have robust responses. They're not showing any rate limiting. They don't have JSON support apparently. They don't have any consistent pluralization, and they aren't using multiple HTTP methods. Now, to me, something sounds off there. Perhaps the Open API Spec I had was the wrong one. I couldn't tell you, but there's something going wrong here. Now, if we remember back to the documentation, they did have pretty good API docs. They did do a lot of good things in there, but maybe their Open API Spec isn't a representation of the documentation portal. That's the only conclusion I can come up with around the design on that Open API Spec. So let's move on to performance and see what we might have found out. Again, load time is good and HTTP2 usage is there. Already doing better than Twilio there because you're using HTTP2. You're not supporting compression, there's no cache and there's no CDN. Now those three I can forgive because of the nature of this API. For a general API, you're going to want to use a CDN and cache and compression. However, this is SMS messages. You may not want that. Let's see what they did well. They did well with security. Now there isn't authorization on all endpoints, so we're failing there. They don't have a CSP header, but they do have content type options. They do have iframe embedding. They do enable strict transport security, and they do have secure URLs. It could be a slight oversight on the authorization perhaps, but they are doing pretty well on security as it is. What I'm thinking here is that perhaps the Open API Spec, it doesn't have everything it needs in it, or I had the wrong version. There's no way to tell without speaking to them, but overall, I would give them the benefit of the doubt here and say they do have a good API. Their spec might be slightly out of sync, but it's a good API. And the documentation makes up for perhaps a lacking in that Open API spec that I'm seeing right now. And finally, let's look at Infobip. So, another F, but this time we got a D for design, an F for performance, and a D for security. Now the one thing to bear in mind with the performance test is that we do actually make requests to that API to get a proper insight. So it could be a demo endpoint that I was getting that caused issues. Let's find out. Let's start with design. They aren't versioning, they're not documenting any rate limiting, and they don't have consistent pluralization. They do have consistent noun usage, they are using multiple HTTP methods, they've got robust responses, and they have JSON support. So the versioning I can live with. The rate limiting could be a documentation oversight, and the consistent pluralization I can almost forgive as well, because sending SMS messages, it's mostly going to be about action-based endpoints. Let's look at performance. We got an F. Looks like Infobip fell over at the same point as Twilio. They aren't using HTTP2. They do have good load time though. The cache, compression and CDN usage just isn't there, which can be forgiven for this type of API. But that HTTP2, I would have expected. Not the worst, not the best. On par so far with Twilio. Security. So they do enable strict transport security, which is a bonus. We've got secure URLs and we've got authorization throughout. Onto a winner right there. They don't have any CSP headers, they don't use any content type option headers, and they aren't disabling any iframe embedding options. Again, not the worst, but better than some that I've seen. Overall, Infobip got 2 Ds and an F. That is actually putting them on par with Vonage, if not slightly in front. If you average out Vonage's C and Fs, they're doing about the same. However, if we bear in mind, something was slightly wrong when we looked at the design of the Vonage API. It all came back failing, which was odd. So I think there's a clear winner here. I think Vonage is definitely leading, with Infobip very closely behind. Unfortunately, Twilio, you've been left at the back of the pack, and to be honest, your API and documentation just does not impress me at all. Which is a shame, because you've had such a good reputation over the last few years that I would have expected better. And remember, if you want to get your API Insights report, you can visit apiinsights.io or search for API Insights in the Mac App Store to use a native client.